Throughout the late 90s, Pokemon was just everywhere, and to this day it's an institution in the game industry. But when looking through the last 30 years of Pokemon, I personally find myself more and more attached to those games that got me invested in the first place. I started playing early on with Red, Blue, Gold, and Silver, but the Game Boy Advance generation was by far the peak of my exposure to the franchise. Just by virtue of being the right age at the right time, Ruby and Sapphire just mean the most to me. I still keep up with the modern Pokemon titles as sort of an outside observer, but I do find myself missing a lot of those great spin-off titles that we got back in the day. Though I think that the spin-offs kind of peaked on the DS. Back on the N64, we had Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, and Pokemon Snap. I got a lot of time out of those early 3D entries. But really all we were thinking back then playing Pokemon Stadium was, where is that full 3D RPG? And while we wouldn't get a main series 3D Pokemon game for decades at that point, we did get a 3D spin-off as an RPG on the GameCube. That game was Pokemon Colosseum. Pokemon Colosseum is really just an anomaly in the franchise. When it first showed up in E3 2003, it seemed like it was an expanded version of the Stadium games, but as time went on, it was revealed to have a fully fleshed out single-player story. The premise of Pokemon Colosseum is that you have to steal Pokemon in order to sort of liberate them. When you looked at the marketing and press releases at the time, it's really clear that this was going to be something entirely different. I'll never forget those weird Save Them All commercials, and I can't even really remember where I first saw them, but they always stood out.
You cannot steal our Pokemon!
Genius Senority was a development team founded in 2002 with the sole purpose of creating Pokemon Colosseum. In an interview from Nintendo Power issue 178, Genius Sonority's staff are interviewed and explain their thoughts on developing Colosseum. In the interview, they say that their original plan was to build a Pokemon game for an older demographic. I think it's probable that Pokemon Colosseum was the only game in the series that was specifically focused for an older, more experienced player. Their goal was to create an entirely new concept that was foreign to the established Pokemon world. While Pokemon has never been afraid of darker elements, in their own words, they wanted to create a new world that was decaying and put the cute Pokemon in there as a contrast. Many of the project leads admitted that they'd never even played a Pokemon game before Colosseum. And it might seem like an insane thing to do now, but it was just a different time for the franchise. These unfamiliar designers led to the game having very distinct characters and places to explore. A lot of them feel like they would never show up in a main Pokemon game today. I think this interview is really important to understanding what makes Pokemon Colosseum so unique. This team was experienced with RPGs, but new to Pokemon, and was willing to take their expertise in order to make something completely new. I feel like Pokemon Colosseum is emblematic of the way that the series has changed in the last 20 years. As time's gone on, I felt like the Pokemon franchise has really started to play it safe, and even though they're introducing new ideas in a lot of new games, they still fall in that established brand. Even compared to its direct sequel, Pokemon XD, Colosseum has its own style, direction, and tone. I don't really think I need to get into it, but Pokemon XD felt like a move to better line up with the established series. For the simplest example, just look at the two playable characters. Maybe XD is a better game by some hard statistics, but I think that Colosseum feels a lot more cohesive and unique. But really, all this stuff didn't matter to me back at the time. It was just really special to see that Pokemon had a full-fledged RPG, and on the GameCube no less. And considering the absolute state of RPGs on the Cube, you had to take what you could get. As a spin-off, Pokemon Colosseum works so well to create something that feels fresh, but still stays within that original Pokemon framework. I hope that after this video is done, you can see why I feel like there's really never going to be another Pokemon quite like Colosseum. This is going to be a long one, so grab some popcorn or get back to that work you're doing, and I'll be here rambling in the background. Let's get right into it with the story mode in Pokemon Colosseum. Pokemon Colosseum opens right into the action with the main character Wes breaking into a secret base out in the deserts of the Ore region. Wes is a former member of Team Snag'em, your typical evil Pokemon organization, but they've managed to create a special Snag'em device that gives them the unholy ability to steal Pokemon straight from trainers. Wes just feels really out of place compared to your typical Pokemon protagonists. It's sort of a simple design, but he's got a really fun 2000s edge to him. In the main series games, throwing a ball at a Pokemon someone owns already is impossible, and it's almost seen as like a weird, rude thing to do. After escaping the hideout, Wes pulls up to a small stand in the outskirts. Right away, Colosseum throws away so many staple aspects of Pokemon. Ore takes a lot of cues from geography of the United States, with the designers specifically mentioning Arizona. The region is barren and mostly covered by desert, and thus has no wild Pokemon. There isn't any tall grass, there's no professor, and there's no routes between towns. There isn't a lot to do here from the start, but you do spot some sketchy guys and another person who gets you into your first battle. For whatever reason, this guy's battle gets the honor of being one of few places where this fantastic music plays. He's got a few Zigzagoons to let you get introduced to your two starter Pokemon, an Espeon and Umbreon. We don't really learn a lot about Wes throughout the game, but I love that he has a clearly defined backstory. There's plenty of evidence that Wes is already established in the region, and it's not only told to you through exposition, but also through in-game details. Wes's Espeon has a high friendship stat when using Return right from the beginning of the game, and starting with 2 evolutions also means that they've been with him for some time. The two of them start at a respectable level in the high 20s, which I think by in-universe standards means that they've already been trained to some degree. Having a main playable character that's already established in the world is something new that doesn't really happen in Pokemon RPGs. After the match, you're told to move on to Phoenix City, west of the outskirts stand. Once you arrive, you catch those sketchy guys from before and get into another fight. Pokemon has always had great music, and it's no different here. The music in Colosseum follows a motif that creates a unique atmosphere for the region. I don't know all that much about musical composition, but there's a lot of cool piano chords and synths done in a way that always felt really sleek and stylish to me. And in that interview from before, they said they did the bulk of the music in 10 days. You end up in a ton of battles in Pokemon Colosseum, and so these tracks being as good as they are is a small blessing. The battle music is really good, but the arrangements for the cities are also worth some regard. Phoenix City's oasis of water is represented in this beautiful song that's really just one of the amazing pieces put out by composer Tsukasa Tawada. All this music is going to be playing throughout the video, but if you've never played Colosseum and don't plan to, the least you can do is listen to the soundtrack. Tawada himself has actually returned to the music a few times on his YouTube channel, and he's got a great rendition of Phoenix City's music. I'd recommend checking that out too. After you beat up their pets, you find a girl named Rui inside their bag. She says that the two of them kidnapped her when she saw a Pokemon with a strange aura, and you end up joining her to see if the mayor has any idea about what's going on. In the plot, these corrupted Pokemon have been turned into fighting machines, capable of attacking people. Rui happens to have a special ability to identify these abnormal Pokemon, and so she ends up following you for the rest of the game. After meeting this definitely not evil guy, you can see the mayor. I don't know if I'm thinking too hard about the mayor's upstairs. I'm not gonna suggest anything. For a short moment, you're free to explore the town and gather items, as well as battle a few locals. Most triggers in the plot won't happen until you walk to one place or another, which leads to a lot of moments like this, where you need to go to the Colosseum, exit to get into a battle, learn that you need to find a place to buy Pokeballs, go to a shop to learn Ore stores don't sell Pokeballs, and end up walking around in circles until you realize that the guy at the outskirts stand sells them. Obviously, walking around and doing objectives isn't anything new in RPGs, but there are a lot of moments where you aren't doing anything but poking around until the story advances. After the walkabout, you meet your first shadow Pokemon, a Makuhita. He's a decent little guy, but immediately after, you can choose to battle and snag a Johto starter Pokemon. These 3 color-coded guys appear at each exit, and only one can battle you. You're allowed to say no and battle a different guy, but I could imagine a lot of people just talk to the first guy right outside the door. While the first guy is probably the best choice, he's got a Bayleaf that can round out your team well. The other 2 have the other Johto starters to choose from. Croconaw is probably tied for the second best choice, but I decided to go with Quilava instead. It's gotta be Quilava, right? He's got quills. Spoilers for much later on, but you can get each of the 3 legendary beasts throughout the story mode. That plus your 2 evolutions and this Johto starter fill up your team to be a max of 6. I'm willing to bet that a lot of people ended up with Espeon, Umbreon, Meganium, Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. I'm going to try to use Pokemon that I haven't before, starting with Quilava. This first section starts your team off, but let's wrap up in Fennec and come back to the subject of party composition in the next town. As you head west, you're going to pass through a construction site. There isn't a lot to do here, but it'll be important later on. I really love these little transition animations that play between areas. Wes's bike is so silly and over-designed, but in a great way. It only has 1 wheel, but hovers around somehow with this massive engine, and of course has a side seat for Rui. It's just ridiculous, but the transitions always make it feel like you've traveled these massive distances, which I guess you are. Pyrite is an impoverished mining town at the end of its life, and it's such a cool idea for a city in Pokemon. It tells this really believable story for a region that's almost all desert, and it feels like it would belong in many RPGs. It's crawling with bandits and thieves and other not so friendly individuals, and even has a little police force that's struggling to keep up with the shadow Pokemon epidemic. There's just a lot of cool little details in the world of Colosseum. I like how all the buildings have walls that are in such a state of disrepair, but they were all clearly once painted with beautiful, vivid colors. It's clear that some time ago, the place was all fresh and bustling, but the desert is slowly taking Pyrite back. In the center of town is a large set of trainers, each with a shadow Pokemon for you to catch. This is the first real chance to construct your team. There's a Misdreavus, Slugma, Flaffy, Noctowl, Skiploom, and Quagsire here for you to catch. 3 of them are grass, fire, and water type, so they'll occupy the missing types that the starters you didn't get would have. It's nice that you get a well-rounded selection to choose from. Of course, they're all shadow Pokemon though, so you have to learn how that works. Shadow Pokemon are the primary mechanic at the core of Pokemon Colosseum. These Pokemon have had their hearts sealed away, and so their stats are hidden when you get them. They can't earn XP, and instead they slowly open a heart gauge as you walk around and battle with them. Since they can't earn experience, they store it and return it to you once you purify their heart later on. The lack of EXP is probably the hardest aspect of training them, but you don't actually have much to worry about. They usually come a few levels above your team, and by the time their levels become an issue, you can start purifying them permanently. They also start with every move except Shadow Rush locked, and you have to gain those moves back as their hearts open up. I used to think Shadow Rush was a frustrating move to be stuck with, but realistically it's more useful than not. It's got 90 power, 100% accuracy, and it hits everything neutrally since it has no type. While the recoil can occasionally cause problems, the damage you receive is really negligible. Sometimes in battle, a shadow Pokemon can enter Hyper Mode. It can be an annoying mechanic, but it's easy to play around. Items can't be used on them in Hyper Mode, and they most likely won't listen to your commands. Hyper Mode also makes Shadow Rush crit more often, but it doesn't really matter. You can't really do anything but select Call to calm them down. When you do that, they lose a big chunk of their heart gauge, which in the long run helps you purify them faster. Hyper Mode also becomes less common as their heart gauge opens up. You have to really work to bring them back to normal in Colosseum, and it helps make them feel different and unwieldy compared to regular Pokemon. After you've finished battling everybody, you'll need to find a way to heal up the team. Pokemon Colosseum is actually one of the only Pokemon games that feature inns as a mechanic. Unfortunately, the implementation of inns wasn't all that thought out. Almost all of the time, you can save that money and take a jog to a nearby healing station, and do it for free. So that really kills the idea right there. After snagging a Shadow Furret, you'll find yourself meeting the Mayor of Pyrite, Duking. One thing leads to another, and you end up helping him repair the windmill in town. Duking has been trying to find out where all the Shadow Pokemon are being distributed, and it looks like winners at the town's Colosseum are given them as prizes. That leaves you to enter and see for yourself. This place distributing Shadow Pokemon is a cool concept, but seems like just a roundabout way to introduce the idea of Colosseums. Considering the name of the game, Colosseums aren't that important, and it really could have been any place giving out Shadow Pokemon here. To win, you've got to complete a couple battles in a row without stopping. After that's over, you can enter the first dungeon of the game to try and stop Mirror B, the guy in charge of the Shadow Pokemon distribution. Mirror B works for Cypher, the evil organization that is the main antagonists in Pokemon Colosseum. Cypher is a separate entity from Team Snag'em, and they want to use Shadow Pokemon in order to take over Ore. If there's one thing in abundance here, it's battling. If you can't stand the long, detailed animations and the sheer number of trainer battles, this game might be a big slog. But for whatever reason, I find it really easy to just enjoy the music and play along. There's just enough strategy involved with each encounter to keep me engaged. Every battle in Colosseum is a double battle, if you haven't already noticed, and I feel like the format gives you a little bit more to think about in every turn. It's really just another thing that makes Pokemon Colosseum a little different than the regular games. For me, the issue isn't so much the length of the battles, but a lot more to do with needless backtracking. Backtracking is an issue I have with the majority of what I would consider the game's dungeons. While you'll find a PC to save and Pokemon healing kiosks from time to time, I always find myself walking back to the previous healing station just in case I lose a future fight or just needed to remove a status effect. There's a pretty common thing in RPGs where you save your resources and end up having a less fun playstyle. Colosseum encounters that problem very frequently. Maybe Rui could have let you save instead of the PCs, or maybe just healed the party after every battle. Rui doesn't really do much besides speak for Wes when needed and spot Shadow Pokemon, so it could have made her feel more valuable. Colosseum's approach of difficulty would have benefited from just letting you heal freely between battles. Without any random encounters, very few locations actually stop you from just taking a long walk back and healing yourself. I've often heard people refer to this game as being harder than other Pokemon games, and while I somewhat agree, I would also say that it's easy to bend the rules in your favor in every Pokemon game. I think difficulty is always a tough balancing act with Pokemon games because the challenge is almost entirely based on your own playstyle. I think that's the reason why there's so many fan challenge runs like Nuzlocke. I have my own playstyle with these games too. I refuse to use items in battle, and I try to use different Pokemon every time I replay the game. Most things in Colosseum can be handled by just choosing certain Pokemon or using items whenever you need to. The game also gets a lot easier if you're willing to just skip certain Shadow Pokemon. This area is just a really long stretch of battles and caves. If you count the previous hideout section and the cave, it feels like it could be the longest dungeon in the game. At the end of the path, you finally meet Mirror B, the first boss. Not counting his Shadow Sudowoodo, his entire team consists of dancing Ludicolo, using Rain Dish and Leech Seed to stall. Mirror B is definitely a character. His over-the-top style and unique battle music make him an instant favorite. I didn't know this until recording the video, but there's also a fake Mirror Bee called Miracle Bee that you can battle if you return to this cave. I'd never heard of this until I happened to find the name in the music tracks. He's got a custom model based on a Cypher Peon, and he has his own distorted version of the Mirror Bee song. And you'll never find him unless you've returned here before finishing the game. It's a neat little Easter egg for people that return to this pretty unimportant area. After the fight, he manages to get away, but you end up saving Duking's Plusle, which I forgot to mention earlier. Plusle decides to come along with you, but it starts at level 13 and it's honestly a bit more work than it's worth. You don't have a lot of electric types to choose from, so you could grind him a bit and add him to your party, but I've never really bothered to do that, and I won't be doing that here. On your way out of Pyrite Town, a fortune teller stops you and says that your fortunes are to the north, in Agate Village, where Rui's family is from. With no other leads, you decide to go there. Agate Village can feel like a bit of a shock after coming from all the decrepit junk towns and deserts of Ore, but it makes sense since the town is tied to Celebi. I like how they hid all these items here behind these secret paths, and the whole town has loads of these little nooks that Rui will get caught on while trying to follow you. When I was a kid, I'd try to catch her on all of these angles just to get away for a bit. It's a game in and of itself, and I still do it all the time. After you arrive, Cypher shows up to destroy this magical relic stone at the center of the forest. This leads to the first really tough fight so far.
It's Pikachu!
His Shadow Hitmontop is almost 10 levels over me, and most of my Shadow Pokemon are hitting the peak of what they can do without being purified. These power spikes are a common complaint with Pokemon Colosseum, and it's going to happen more and more over time. They're manageable, but you have to be careful in some fights. Playing with status effects and that sort of thing is probably your best bet. Using Sing and Confuse Ray are really solid options that can help you turn the tides around. Looks like I'm dead. I'll just hit that reset, thank you. When you lose a battle in Colosseum, you still follow the old rule of losing half your money, but you can only save at PCs anyways, so I would just reset the game when I lose. Money is in short supply, and so Pokeballs are worth holding on to. If you get them back from restarting, then that's something that you should do. After the battle, you can finally purify your team for good. It's incredibly satisfying to see everything you've got so far get all that XP at once. Plus, a few of them might evolve too. There's a really short list of evolvable Pokemon in Colosseum, but odds are that you're at least using the Johto starter and they might evolve here. Now that they've officially become your Pokemon, you can name them too. I used to never name Pokemon, but nowadays, if I can't think of something clever, they're at least getting a random noise for a name. You can also go and rename Espeon and Umbreon at the Name Raider, but I just couldn't do it. Those two kind of feel like they're Wes's and not mine. I think it's a great payoff for all the work you've done, and it's something that I always look forward to on replays. On the other hand though, it's weirdly easy to avoid this really important mechanic. Nobody really explains exactly what you have to do, and everyone makes it sound like you need a time flute, but those are just consumable items that you can use to purify one Pokemon for free. I just kind of think it's weird that they never deliberately tell you that you can go purify your Pokemon now. I'm pretty settled into my team at this point. I've got Umbreon, Espeon, Mantine, Quilava, Jumpluff, and a Swablu. Jumpluff and Umbreon work well as status effect guys that can help with snagging Pokemon, while Espeon and soon-to-be Typhlosion can do some solid damage. Mantine is here because I think he's just a funny guy, and Swablu, I considered swapping for Hitmontop, but I didn't end up doing it. Now that we've purified all of our Pokemon, we can follow a distress call from Duking to head to Mount Battle. Probably the most defining location to Ore is Mount Battle, a giant volcano that's been turned into a sort of battle tower. Cypher lackeys have taken over the place, and you've got to climb up with one battle on each step. This is probably the first of a few big jumps in difficulty throughout the story mode. All of a sudden, my entire team was 5 levels under the average trainer's Pokemon. It still isn't too much trouble to get to the boss though, since most trainers don't have a full team, and you can always head back to the lobby to heal. Dakim is the boss of Mount Battle, and the second Cypher admin after Mirror B. Before the fight, I went to go grab some timer balls. These boss battles tend to go on pretty long, so they can come in handy. Bosses in Pokemon Colosseum are a real highlight. Since every battle is a double battle, bosses make really good use of the synergy that two Pokemon can have. Miraby from before did have a solid strategy himself, but his team was pretty one note. Dakim's team focuses on protecting one Pokemon in order to go hard on earthquakes without the risk of hurting himself. I feel like this fight is probably the most cited example of Pokemon Colosseum having good team design. And for a good reason. If you have no flyers or you skipped out on a water type, he's gonna wreck you. At this point, the bosses will start using one of the 3 legendary beasts to fight you, all of which are shadow Pokemon to catch. I'm not going to be using Entei or any of the legendaries in this playthrough because I feel like it's a bit boring to do so. Not saying you can't do that yourself, it does make the game a lot easier. Dakim has several Pokemon with double weaknesses to take advantage of, and once they're clear, you can focus on catching Entei. That is, until he recoils himself to death. Yep, just restart that one too. After Mount Battle, I decided to get a bit of levels in for my struggling party members. I feel like I've heard that Pokemon Colosseum is difficult for people because of its lack of grinding opportunities. There aren't any wild encounters, so it might seem like it's the case, but if you look around, there's plenty of chances to get some levels. You can go to the Fennec Pre-Gym, the Colosseums, or now the entirety of Mount Battle. In most RPGs, I avoid grinding like the plague, but the reality is that Colosseum will require you to do a bit of grinding once in a while. If you don't care about catching all the shadow Pokemon, it can make things easier, but it feels weird to not do that, so I always try to get them all. Catching shadow Pokemon is a big part of what makes Colosseum so difficult, and I feel like it's something that goes a bit ignored when it comes to discussing the game's challenges. I tried to keep my grinding to a minimum, got a few levels, and I was ready for the next section. Hey, just a heads up, if you made it this far, please consider subscribing to the channel. I do all sorts of reviews of games from cult classics to old favorites, and if you're enjoying this video so far, you'll probably like some of the other ones I've done. Back to Colosseum. Thanks. Along with Shadow Entei, you can also grab a Time Flute. I'm pretty sure there's one for every legendary, and you can use them to skip these extra long heart gauges that they have. I used it on Entei just to show it off, because it has a special cutscene with Celebi. A new location shows up on the map, a mysterious lab. But as soon as you get there, Duking sends you a message saying they captured some Cypher grunts. One of them is sleeping in their cell, and they have a key that you can steal. Last time you were in Pyrite Town, there was this elevator that you couldn't use before, but now you can get there with the key. The Under has got to be my favorite location in Pokemon Colosseum, and this stretch feels like a cool little separated moment. The Under is what's left of the mines that Pyrite was founded on. A lot of the people down here speak about how the Under has been abandoned over the years, leading a lot of sketchy folks to come down and hide. What was once a bountiful mining town has been stripped bare and abandoned by the rich baron that founded it. There's loads of neon signs and rundown shops, along with another great music track that gets that seedy tone across. Right as you arrive though, you're introduced to Cypher admin Venus, who declares a spy is in the city. Venus rules over the Under through these dystopian broadcasts that play on all the TVs. Everybody in the Under is in love with her, and she uses her platform to convince everyone to look out for that spy. I really like how the Under has this little episodic narrative. Of course, you have to assume that you're the spy that they're after. And you can even tell people that you are, but nobody believes you because you look so weak to them. Based on how underleveled I am, I think I should believe them too. You also meet these hacker kids that live in the Under who end up helping you with gathering leads. In a fun twist, the spy is revealed to be Silva, Dewking's assistant that we met before. He traced the Shadow Pokemon distribution to the Under, but then got captured. They slip you this key that lets you get into the next dungeon, and you can get there with this public transit UFO. While you're battling all these Cypher guys, have you ever really read their names? Not even just them. Everybody in Ore has some weird name. Like this guy with the Whale Lord's name is Gurks. I've probably said at least one name in the game so far that you don't agree with the pronunciation for. Mirror B, Dakim, Dakim, I don't know. It's hard to even know if I'm saying any of these names right. I think it has something to do with the character limit, but I've always found it pretty funny that Colosseum has some of these just weird names. Venus's boss battle actually took me by surprise because I'd forgotten that it starts right away. The level gap is pretty out of hand at this point, but I really think with smart play and good team composition, you can make it work. In Colosseum, taking advantage of Pokemon's mechanics is pretty important if you want to avoid the grind. My Typhlosion's been pretty kitted out with everything I need to catch Suicune with. Sunny Day stops them from doing any major damage with Surf, and once the smoke screens are laid down, it's free game to throw Ultra Balls. Between that and my Jumpluff, I can sleep and smokescreen any Shadow Pokemon, and that usually works out. I really do think that Colosseum's limitations give you an opportunity to flex your knowledge of Pokemon's mechanics. Grinding will always be an option for less experienced players, but you can work around that level gap with good strategy. Even though I didn't expect it, the Venus fight went way better than the one against Dakim. She tries to make a break for it, and you have to chase Venus through a row of battles. Oh, there goes Gligar. I know you can get a second chance to catch most Pokemon, but I don't really want to bother with that. And like I said before, it's much easier to restart. Maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you weren't aware, Pokemon Colosseum was developed partially as an easy way to reintroduce Johto Pokemon back into the series. The Hoenn games on Game Boy Advance featured a few returning Pokemon from the first two generations, but they were unable to connect back to the original Game Boy games. The majority of obtainable Pokemon in Colosseum are from Johto, in order to band-aid that issue. I don't know if it's something to be critical of, but Johto's Pokemon, for whatever reason, always felt really weak to me. It doesn't help that Johto's Pokédex functions like an expansion to the original 150 in a way that few games in the future would. Because of that, new team members can be pretty few and far between at this point of the game. Since the entire Johto dex had to be included, you end up with some randomly high-level Pokemon that typically were meant for the early game of Gold and Silver. If you dropped a Pokemon out of your party to pick up this level 43 Stantler, comment "I like Stantler" a regular amount down below. In other news, my Swablu also finally evolved into an Altaria. Swablu was really struggling to keep up, and because they fainted during the level up, it skipped learning Dragon Breath. There's no way to relearn moves in Pokemon Colosseum, so I guess I'm sorta just screwed out of having that move. I was thinking of replacing Swablu at one point anyway, so I'm not too concerned about it, but it would have really sucked if it was somebody I was planning to keep. Once you get through the stairwell, you take a subway car connecting to that lab from earlier. A few things happen, and it leads you right back to the Shadow Pokemon Lab, the next main dungeon. I'm pretty underleveled again and seriously need to grind a bit, so let's hop into the Under Colosseum. Maybe not. Who made this place? The interior of the Shadow Pokemon Lab is so far from what could actually seem believable, even for a GameCube game. The entire place has so many weird dead ends for seemingly no reason, gameplay or otherwise. As you make your way through, you can find these DNA samples that show you a few different Shadow Pokemon. These Pokemon you scan are part of a code used to unlock the door at the end of the dungeon. I think that if you missed some Shadow Pokemon, it could have been a neat way to see what you've missed, but it isn't programmed to show anything that you haven't seen yet. For no good reason, the PC at the entrance doesn't have a healing station. If you're familiar with how the PCs work in Pokemon, you'll know that you can actually just deposit your entire party and then withdraw them fully healed, which makes the lack of a healing station that much worse. I can just drop everybody in the box and save myself a walk to the nearest Pokemon Center. It's an unnecessary complication, and it means that after a few battles, when I clear out a section of the lab, I have to return here and do this process all over again. I recently added Sneasel to my team, replacing Altaria. Sneasel is a great Pokemon, but I really don't think that it's built for a consistent wave of battles like in Colosseum. It's supposed to be a fast attacker, but it's too squishy and just gets knocked out constantly. So I'm gonna pick up this Shadow Vibrava instead. With Vibrava on board, I've got my team for the rest of the game locked in. I think if you break it down, Colosseum has the most limited selection of Pokemon from any RPG in the franchise. There's a total of 48 obtainable Pokemon, but you get about 15 of them at the end of the game, so they're probably closer to 35. The Pokemon you choose from will play a big part in the challenge of the game. You could use the 3 legendary beasts like I mentioned before, and that would make the game a lot easier, but if you used Remoraid or Plusle, I'd imagine it would require a lot more grinding. Sometimes though, I think limitations can create really unique gameplay. Pokemon is one of those RPGs that works best when it creates small stories through gameplay. Maybe your weakest team member clutches out a close gym battle, or your MVP starts falling off partway through a game. Picking names and changing moves are a big part of what makes Pokemon so special. You grow attached to your team, and the mechanics foster that relationship. I think that since Colosseum is so limited in its party selection, it can actually force you to get creative and use some Pokemon that you've never considered before. In the past, I've played through the game with a Furret and a Macargo. They're some of the worst choices in the main series, but here they're one of the few options for a solid normal type or fire type. In this run, I've actually gotten pretty attached to my Jumpluff named Fresh. Fresh has been clutching out lots of encounters by stalling out Shadow Pokemon, and their synthesis works really well with my Typhlosion Sunny Day. Or like my Mantine. I don't even know where I'd get a Mantine in Gold and Silver, but being able to use one here has been great. Pokemon's mechanical foundation has always been so good, and it's really underappreciated sometimes. It all does a lot to keep Colosseum interesting despite its limited aspects. The lab isn't exceptionally memorable or anything, but it gave us an excuse to explore how Shadow Pokemon were made. Back in the subway, they had cages and stuff for transporting them between the lab and the Under. As you make your way through Colosseum, you go layer by layer to understand exactly how every step of the Shadow Pokemon distribution works. Ein is the boss at the end of the Shadow Pokemon Lab. He's got a Shadow Raikou, the last legendary beast, and a good lineup of tanky walls like Altaria. He'll use Rain Dance to set up for his Raikou's Thunder, but thankfully I can just clear it up with Sunny Day. Don't sleep on those timer balls. At least now, the last of the legendary beasts is ours, and we can bring some data we found back to the Under. Those kids from the Under are still helping you solve the Shadow Pokemon case. You give them the data disk you found in the lab, and it turns out to be a full list of all Shadow Pokemon Cypher has created. It's still encrypted, but it'll be updated as time goes on. We're almost at the last major area of the game, so I went to purify my Vibrava first. When you're focused on just purifying Pokemon, you have a few options like battling, but just spending some money on scents and walking around in circles should cover most of them. I also purified Sudowoodo and Sneasel, but I didn't end up using them. Everybody in the Under has been saying that the tower at the construction site from way before is finally done. With Vibrava set up, we're ready for the final stretch. Relgam Tower, a massive skyscraper built right in the center of Ore. When you get there, they actually don't do anything to stop you, and instead, most of them are just trying to get a chance to fight you. Railgun Tower is built up into 3 parts and starts with a boss rush. You're free to heal up between the battles, but each of the 4 Cypher admins return with brand new teams. I think a lot of people would frown upon boss rushes like this, but when the whole game is battling, it's hard to argue that this isn't the ride you've been on the entire time. I started with Mirror B, but just barely lost out, so I decided to go and try the other ones. There's still Shadow Pokemon to catch, and I got a few more before trying to beat Dakim. I really love that each boss is defined by a strategy more than any specific Pokemon. Other than Mirror B's Ludicolo, every boss has a brand new team, and they don't even use a new Shadow Pokemon. Dakim still has his Earthquake-focused doubles team, but now uses a more diverse lineup with a Flygon and Whiscash. Mirror B's healing strategy gets some buffs with Ice Beam for coverage, and so on. Thankfully, these rematches don't feel too much like padding, and instead give you a good sense of how far your team has come. If only they didn't have to use items. I don't know if they still do this, but it's really something that bugs me in every Pokemon game. Venus, for example, has 5 Pokemon, so why not just give her a team of 6 and not let them use items? It pretty much always adds up to be 1 extra Pokemon anyway, and it just wastes your time. After we finish Ein off, Rui's granddad calls us and gives us a Master Ball. I went to go pick it up since it'll make the final boss a lot easier. Now that we have all 4 keys, we can enter the main tower and the second section of Railgun. It's a bit funny that the next section is just a lobby full of hostile trainers. Everyone there has just been waiting for you, and you have to crawl through every single battle. I thought more people here would have had Pokemon to catch, but there actually aren't that many Johto Pokemon left. Railgun is a pretty cool location for a final area. There's a casino, Sudowoodo statues everywhere, and also these massive chairs in the dining room. Pokemon Colosseum really has a good contrast between its locations. People in the majority of Ore are clearly struggling to get by, and the extravagance of the tower, it really demonstrates the divide between the corrupt Cypher organization and the regular people who just get involved with crime to get by. Did they just get political? The end of the lobby leads you to a battle with your old boss, the Snag'em team leader, Gonzap. I feel like he should have had a more important role in the plot. Team Snag'em as a whole were kind of meant to have a relationship with Wes, but at this point it doesn't feel relevant at all. He explains before the battle that Cypher invented the Snag'em device and that he works for them in some capacity, but the way the plot unfolds never made that clear. Team Snag'em isn't Cypher, but they feel like one and the same. There's some cool ideas for the plot, but like many RPGs from the time, the execution isn't quite there. He still provides a really tough battle though. No real strategy as far as I can tell, just a pile of really strong and tanky Pokemon. Skarmory was a lot of trouble for me to catch because it's set to such a low catch rate. Pokemon Colosseum has custom catch rates for all these shadow Pokemon, and for whatever reason they gave Skarmory the same odds as Entei and Suicune. Once Skarmory is secured, we can enter the final section of Railgun Tower, Railgun Colosseum. The Colosseum here is a gauntlet of shadow Pokemon, high levels, and unlike the other Colosseums, you don't get fully healed between matches. It looks like I'm gonna need a few more levels and to buy some Pokeballs before I give it another try. It looks like it's back to Mount Battle for me. While I take this time to level up a bit, I wanted to address something I've noticed while writing this script. I've come to realize it's really easy to be critical of Pokemon Colosseum. I've noticed that I've been having an easier time explaining the hiccups I had along the way instead of focusing on the reasons I wanted to make this video in the first place. Pokemon Colosseum is a really unique entry in the series, and that's sort of what I wanted to come across with. Replaying it from front to back has given me an opportunity to dive deep and think about the game holistically, taking it for what it is. In the end, Colosseum was an experiment and a risk that very few franchises at the size of Pokemon are willing to take, and I hope I've made that clear this far. Even though it stumbles frequently with the amount of grinding and lopsided story, it brought a lot to a series that oftentimes feels really stagnant. I really love the twist on the formula, and that slight shift in tone has given it so much more of a unique identity. I think that uniqueness is probably why Colosseum and Gale of Darkness have such cult fan bases in the greater Pokemon community. Plus, I'm sure being locked away on the GameCube, the most cult statusy Nintendo console, helped a lot. Anyway, it looks like we're done grinding, so we can get back to Railgun Colosseum. There are a total of 6 catchable Pokemon in this one segment, one in each of the 6 battles that you have to do in a row. You might think it's about time to reset, but actually, you can save yourself some trouble by just accepting a loss and entering again after you've caught all the Shadow Pokemon. You keep any Shadow Pokemon that you catch during a battle, even if you lose. The trainers will just replace those Shadow Pokemon with something else if you catch them. Just spend all the money you have and run your head into the wall until it works. They spare you after the first Colosseum segment and fully heal your party just before the final boss. It took me a while to get through Nascour. His team is full of really bulky Pokemon that I just didn't really have an answer for. Walrein in particular gave me a lot of issues since I had no access to an electric type move. I had to repeat the first few battles until I got strong enough, and honestly lucky enough, to just sleep and confuse my way through the fight. I really love the restraint they have to just play no music during what is meant to be the final battle. It really adds to the intensity of the situation, with the only thing in the background being the roar of the crowd. I kept running at it until I managed to get a decisive win on him, and I even managed to get his Shadow Metagross with the first ball that match. After finally getting past Nascour, the mayor of Phoenix shows up, and he's suddenly revealed to be the big bad guy the whole time. It's honestly a silly last-minute twist, considering you don't even really know the guy. He really just shows up like he was an important character and then pretends like it's a shock. He does look pretty freaky, but I think it could have been a better twist if it was basically anybody else. But the real twist is that all my footage of this part got lost. I don't know what I did, but after I finished the game, I saved and I couldn't go back to re-record it. So most of the footage you've been seeing here is from me re-entering the Colosseum and recording it after catching Shadow Metagross and Tyranitar. Evice or Evice, or whatever you're supposed to say, was actually a lot easier than Nascour. Your team gets fully healed for a second time for this surprise encounter, and his team just had more weaknesses and less bulk. I managed to keep his entire team asleep for a lot of the battle, and just took them all down one at a time with some good swaps. Fresh and Funyun, my Flygon, were a winning combo of type coverage and support. The AI will get really hung up on knocking out a Pokemon that it thinks it can one-hit KO, so spamming Protect took advantage of that. Having that Master Ball on hand for the Tyranitar makes it a 5v6 battle anyway, which helps a lot. Once I actually made it past Nascour, it only took me one try, and since my footage is all gone, you're just gonna have to believe me. After you beat him, he tries to escape one last time, but a Ho-Oh comes and stops him. This Ho-Oh is sort of a protector spirit of Ore that lives on Mount Battle. I like how they say a Ho-Oh, since there's another one in Johto. With all the allies arriving just in time, you manage to get the 2 leads of Cypher into custody. And that brings us to the credits and the end of Pokemon Colosseum. After you finish the game, you can start up your save data to find that Shadow Pokemon have continued to appear around Pyrite Town. This small section after the story is over gives you the remaining Johto Pokemon and sets you up to get the game's completion reward. Plus there's a couple new areas to explore, so let's check it out. Soon you'll get word of some disturbances at the old Snag'em base from the start of the game. This gives you a new area to explore, along with a bunch of rematches with past trainers that'll have Shadow Pokemon that you might have missed. I haven't missed any so far, but it's nice to see that nearly every obtainable Pokemon can be attempted at least twice. The whole postgame has you following email to email, returning to a few places in order to track down the remaining Shadow Pokemon. You can even get the other 2 starter Pokemon that you didn't choose back in Fennec. I like that all of the Shadow Pokemon you've missed have the same levels, since you can't level them up until they're purified. It's probably unintentional, but consistent with the rules they've established. After catching Croconaw, we can go back to the Under and get another lead from the kids. This ends up bringing you back to Gurks and having another battle with him. I really love how they give him 2 Wailords on purpose now in order to really show off the scale. After the battle, he'll give you a tip to go check out the Shadow Pokemon Lab again. Honestly, all these rematches make it seem like they didn't expect you to catch every Shadow Pokemon on your first try. Since I've already caught everything, there isn't much to do here, so you can just leave and get another email to head right back to the Snag 'em base. As you explore the old base, you'll snag an Ursaring and Smeargle, and get a good look at these original snag machines. When you're done at the Snag 'em base, you get to have a rematch with Gonzap, which gives you a UFO disc, which leads you to a new area, the Deep Colosseum. Under the Under, there's a whole other Colosseum with its champion, the Deep King, holding the second to last Shadow Pokemon, a Shuckle. The Deep Colosseum has you grinding through 4 Colosseum challenges. Each time you finish, you get a third rematch with the major bosses from the story. They'll have some new Pokemon, but they all use the same strategies as before, so you know what to expect. After each run, the levels rise more and more, and eventually you'll be facing off against Pokemon that are well into the 60s. My team ended off around the high 50s, but I never really found anything in the postgame that was more challenging than the bosses in the actual campaign. I think by now my team was more than capable of taking on Pokemon that are a few levels higher than them. After 20 long battles, I finally got to the king himself. It actually wasn't too bad, since his team doesn't really have any hard hitters. Things like Girafarig and Sableye aren't really a huge threat. After Shuckle, there's only 1 Shadow Pokemon left, and I just had to run around until I got another email. Within no time, you'll find out that there's a clone of Wes running around with a Shadow Togetic, and he's harassing people all over the place. The news on TV leads you back to where it all started, where you can have a battle with the other Wes. This is pretty much the final battle in Colosseum story mode. He's got a solid team, all nearing level 70, and unlike the Deep King, he actually has some threatening Pokemon. Gyarados and Milotic can be an issue if you're not prepared. Again, my lack of electric moves really hurt me, but his Togetic is actually only level 20, so once the team was taken care of, I could just catch it pretty simply. I didn't get wiped out, but it was a pretty tough battle. And that's sort of just it. It turns out that the fake Wes was actually just a Cypher member that's good at disguising himself. I actually feel like this postgame was planned to be a part of the main story. The section between the Shadow Pokemon Lab and Railgun Tower always felt really rushed to me, and the email features go pretty much unused until they're needed to fill in gaps for this postgame. Having this clone show up also just feels like an unfinished idea. But by now, all there's left to do is raise those Shadow Pokemon, get them purified, and then trade them off to a main series game. Once everything gets traded from Colosseum, it sort of turns into an empty husk. I remember having a save data filled with nothing but Pidgeys after I had traded everything away. But that's really the end of the story for Wes, Rui, and the rest of the characters in Pokemon Colosseum. While I mainly wanted to focus this video on the story mode and what that brings to the table, I still want to quickly talk about the Colosseum Mode content. Being announced as a pseudo-sequel to Pokemon Stadium, Colosseum still features connectivity to the main games on Game Boy Advance. Using that often forgotten Game Boy Advance to GameCube link cable, you too can battle in 3D on the big screen. Along with that, there are some features exclusive to Colosseum that I think are pretty cool to see. The Mount Battle Challenge is fully playable in both single and double battles. If you manage to get all 48 Shadow Pokemon purified in story mode, you can take your team and complete all 100 steps of Mount Battle and earn yourself a special Ho-Oh. I've already done that years ago, and it would probably double my playtime, so I won't be doing it here again, but I do still have the Ho-Oh I got years ago on my Pokemon Moon. It's a pretty nice reward all in all for doing everything the game has to offer. You can also try the challenge out with any team from your Game Boy games. If you've hooked up your Game Boy Advance to Pokemon Colosseum, you can register a team to play battles and earn some items. While it's a bit of a slog to play through it all, you do get to run around as your trainer in 3D. It's really limited since you're stuck on Mount Battle, but I find it weirdly satisfying to see Red running around in 3D. And the fact that the game is compatible with Fire Red and Leaf Green at all is notable, since the games came out months after Colosseum. Obviously, the developers were well aware of each other's projects, but it's just a good detail to see. There's also one more feature that I've basically never seen covered in regards to Pokemon Colosseum, that being the 12 vs 12 multi-battle. By gathering up to 4 Game Boys along with 4 link cables, you can run a massive 12 vs 12 double battle in a Colosseum. It took me 10 minutes just to set the whole thing up, but it was truly glorious. It's hard to imagine that anybody ever did this in person, but I bet that if it did happen to you, you probably still remember it. I still fondly remember setting up things like Zelda 4 Swords Adventures, so I'd love to hear from anybody who's had a chance to actually try this. Even thinking about getting this 12v12 mode to work at all will take some effort. Not only do you need all the hardware involved, but you'd also need everybody to own the Game Boy games and have trained 4 distinct teams all ready to go. Unfortunately, due to Colosseum's limited rule sets, you can't force any Pokemon to be the same level. That, alongside the issue of having enough friends willing to even play 12v12, can lead to a lot of unfair fights. I just happen to have all of my cartridges at relatively the same point in the game, but I still had some Pokemon sitting in the 30s versus Pokemon that were in the 60s. I don't know if 12 vs 12 was ever a thing in the other Pokemon games, but it might have been an option in Pokemon XD. Either way, it started here. As time went on, I think these sort of novelty game modes became less of an important feature, but I still think having a chaotic 12v12 double battle, or even triple battle, would be a really fun party mode to add to the new entries. I think the addition of a full-length RPG meant Pokemon Colosseum had to make some cuts in terms of the expansion-style content that you found on Pokemon Stadium. Mount Battle is really all the game has in terms of link cable content, other than entering the titular Colosseum challenges. I wonder if there were some people disappointed at the lack of mini-games in Pokemon Colosseum. But really, you gotta give it to those folks at Genius Senority back in the day. They not only delivered that full single player, but managed to keep some of the core features of Stadium alive. Pokemon Colosseum is just such a unique game. When you have a franchise as massive as Pokemon is, creating something genuinely different in those constraints feels like an impossible task. 20 years ago, Genius Senority produced the most cult classic entry in the series. The music is incredible, the main character is delightfully edgy, and the Shadow Pokemon mechanic, I think, is a really underappreciated twist on the formula. Even though Colosseum can get bogged down with frequent level spikes and some drawn-out animations, it's hard not to compare the good qualities it has to some of the issues that the new games have today. It's pretty clear to me that the Pokemon Company wants nothing to do with these games because of how different they are. But here's hoping that it at least ends up on a future GameCube Virtual Console where it can be enjoyed for the oddity that it is. Maybe at some point I will return to Pokemon XD and go through that game, but for now I hope you enjoyed this extra long dive into Colosseum. I find Pokemon Colosseum is weirdly easy to fall back into, and I had a great time going through it with a bit more of an observant point of view. If you've made it this far, I can't thank you enough for watching all the way through, and if you enjoyed this one, you might like my video on the Mega Man X RPG on the GameCube. I've had it in my mind to do these sort of deep dives for all of the GameCube's RPGs, but I think that since they take so long, I can't do them all back to back. I just wanted to say thanks again for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and liking the video. All that stuff helps support the channel and lets more people find the video. With all that said, so long, and take care.